Good evening. Hello. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Tortoise. My name is Liz Moseley. I'm one of the editors and partners here. You're all very welcome to our newsroom for this, unofficially the second, but officially the first conversation in a season of Think-Ins that we are doing on the future of learning in partnership with the people who own this building where we live, who are called Fora. I edited a series of Think-Ins last year called The Future of Work, where we talked about all manner of things, corporate culture and mental health in the workplace and all kinds of things. And we didn't land on a big piece of journalism out of that series of conversations. What we landed on was another set of questions. And this season of Think-Ins is to try and tackle some of those questions, because we realised that in order to understand the future of work, we kind of had to go back a bit and try and understand the future of learning. What are we going to need to know? How are we going to need to know it? And so this season of Think-Ins is trying to look at the current way of learning things, partly informal education, partly other types of education, to see if it's working and what might need to change. And this evening's conversation focuses on higher education. Can I just get a quick show of hands of who has not been to a Think-In before? Okay, perhaps I'll tell you what one is then. So what we're trying to do at Tortoise is produce news in a different kind of way. Two really big heresies in journalism is that we're not interested in going fast. We like to go slow. We don't care about being first. We like to do the news not as it happens, but when it's ready. And secondly, that we want to listen rather than tell. So this that you're in is a version of a news conference that happens in all the newsrooms, TV and newspapers all over the world every day, where a bunch of journalists get together and talk to one another about what they think about a thing. And we think we'll do better work as a newsroom if we don't only talk to one another about what we think about a thing, but invite you, our members, and other invited experts to inform our point of view and shape the way that we report the world. So this evening is a conversation where I would like you to do more of the talking than I do. And at the end of it, when Agatha, who is our tortoise here, has made her stately way across the screen, she will wave a flag in the air, and that means we've done an hour and time's up. And I will do my best to try and summarise where we think we've got to on the question. Now, I should start with a little bit of an apology, because I've already been told off by my colleague Chris Cook, who's left, but his parting shot as he left the office, because he loves to rant about the education system, it's his favourite thing to do, and he's left the office and he said, I'm already cross about the question, because obviously higher education is not at an all-time low, it's obviously the best it's ever been. So, notwithstanding Chris's anger with me, I just felt that in another life I was involved in marketing, and is higher education altogether perfect isn't as good a hook of an evening. So we just went for the slightly more aggravating question. We are joined by some brilliant people who have very particular expertise in this area, and I'm going to introduce them shortly, but can I also just get a sense of who is here? So who here is currently an undergraduate studying for a degree? Okay, that side of the room mainly. And who is here is a graduate who has done a degree at some point in their life? Is anybody here neither of those things, who has chosen not to or not done it? Okay, brilliant. This is good. We've got representation from here. It's great. Can I go back to some of the people who put their hands up over there and ask you why you chose to do a degree? Anybody? Who's going to be brave and open the bidding? Go on. I'll pay you £10. Yes, sir. What's your name?
Curran.
Sorry?
Curran.
Curran.
I'm doing an undergraduate degree in design, and I did it because of multiple reasons. I think pressure from family to kind of do the right thing, and then also as a kind of like personal, comfortable thing that you kind of put yourself in this system, and you kind of like don't have to worry about the big picture just yet.
So it was deferring adulthood?
Yeah, essentially, yeah.
And you did a design degree?
Yeah, currently.
Okay, and you're still doing it? Who else? Let's have another example. Hello, what's your name?
I'm Michelle.
Hi, Michelle.
I'm on the same degree.
Okay.
And I personally did a degree because in the place that I was in at the time, when I finished high school, everybody did a degree. So it didn't even come to my mind to question whether I should do one or not. It was just the norm. So not doing a degree was basically frowned upon at that point. So I did one because that's what I thought I should do.
Interesting. And you've chosen design?
Design as well.
Okay, is that design to me? I did an English literature degree, so design sounds like a really, really useful thing to study relative to what I did. Is that part of the reckoning on choosing to do design? What it enables you to do afterwards? Or not really?
Actually, I think on the contrary, for me personally, it was a bit of a risk because arts and design, it's not something that you would do necessarily to get money. It's something you do because you love to do it.
Okay.
So I'm quite happy with the degree I chose.
Okay, interesting. Okay, I'm going to try. I might come to Paul actually with a question. We've heard a couple of examples of people's motivations who are currently studying degrees, which are deferring adulthood because you love it, those kinds of things. So Paul Curran is the president of City University, so obviously runs a big and very important academic institution. What do you think university is for?
Goodness, that's a big question. Certainly, undergraduate education is part of it. That is, if you take my university, for example, undergraduate education of UK students accounts to about 22% of our activity. So it's not the majority of our activity, but it's extremely important. So to put that in context, the purpose of my university, I'll start with that first, and it's been the same purpose for 125 years, is to transform the lives of students, create new knowledge, contribute to business and the professions, and contribute to the global good of society. And there are the four things we focus on. That's what gets people up in the morning. And the thing that links all those together is this notion of service. And it's so we're not doing it for our own ends, but we're doing it because we want to serve students or serve society more broadly. Is that a good starting point?
Yeah, it's a really good starting point. Who has a different view on what university is for from support? Or does that broadly capture it? Those are big and lofty aims. They will transform the lives of the students, create new knowledge, contribute to the there's a businessy one, an economic one, and the global good of society. Does that feel like a good set of goals for higher education to people? Is there yes, hello, what's your name?
My country, I'm not from England. We used to say that universities are to get employment to the students. Okay. So undergrad is a big part of our education system. I belong to a university, so we have 40,000 students, mostly undergrad.
What are you studying?
I studied business.
But now you teach?
Now I am in charge of a part of the organization. So what we have there, we have better wages and also better payment and also employment through the university. Otherwise, you'll not be well employed in my country at least.
Okay, thank you. Of the people who are currently studying their degree, who, when you were thinking, where am I going to go, what am I going to do, who looked at things like employability statistics of the people who do this course when you were making your decisions? Hands. Well, I'm going to pick on you. What are you studying at the moment?
Same as everyone else, design.
Oh, you're all doing design? Are you all together? Oh, okay. So you looked specifically at employability. What other things were you considering when you were choosing the course?
Like standard of life.
Have I asked you where you're doing your course? Sorry.
Oh, so we're doing it at Goldsmiths.
Oh, Goldsmiths.
So it's just like student life, the area, a load of people that are there.
Okay. Can we show a graph, Jack? The satisfaction one. Is that possible? So can you see here? This is a graph that talks to, and it's in your book if it's easier to see, percentage of students, and the data doesn't specify if it's undergraduate or postgrad.
It's undergraduate.
It's all undergraduate. Who gave the two most positive answers, definitely or mostly agree on these various different measures of satisfaction on their courses. And if you read this, you think it's pretty good. As a many moons ago, I was a student. I look at this and I think this is a really good reading of the assessment, and that students are happy, and the teaching is good, and the learning opportunities are great, and assessment and feedback is good.
Yeah,
Yes?
it is. I mean, compared to many organisations you might look at outside, those sort of satisfaction figures are high. But they vary a lot, of course, between programmes,
Yeah.
between institutions, and they vary over time. And the thing that's happened, as I said, these are undergraduate numbers, so I shouldn't be pointing in the air. Is the screen?
It's this one.
Is that when the cap came off undergraduate student numbers, which it did for the Russell Group in 2012 and for the rest in 2015, it generated deliberately, that was the purpose, competition on one of the things that universities are now competing on very directly, are those metrics.
Yeah.
So not surprisingly, they've increased year on year.
Yeah. Claire.
Mm-hmm.
Claire is Vice President of the NUS Higher Education bit. When you look at these kinds of satisfaction criteria, does this feel representative to you of what the students that you represent are telling you?
Yes. No. I guess I'm not surprised to see Student Union at the very bottom, because it just, feedback, we get oversaturated with it as students.
Right.
And there's only so much a metric can tell you. And I think it just loses so much. Like so NUS is National Union of Students.
Yeah.
So my role is to advocate and fight for students' rights.
Yeah.
And a better environment for students. And it's not about satisfaction. It's not about being a customer. So I said yes and no, because it's only one measure.
I'm really interested in that thing if it's not about being a customer. So I mentioned briefly before, sorry, back to you, Jen, that in another life I worked in marketing a lot. So I was one of those people who send you the dreaded survey that says, do you like this? And on a scale of 1 to 5. And this feels like it's born of that world, that kind of metric, that kind of rating, and it talks to a market, a competitive market that Paul just mentioned. But as you say, you're there to fight for student rights and a better environment for students. So what are some of the things that worry you about that, the current higher education world, that we don't see here?
What currently worries me is that idea that we are just about our student fee income. And then that leaves you do not care about the student there, you don't care about the community you're building, and that means that the university becomes a space of a lack of care and a lack of actual support, because it's supporting you to actually learn. But when it's all about just how satisfied we are, there's really quick wins you can do to get satisfaction rates up. There's also the idea of you don't ask every student on these kind of NSS score results. Because, what I'm concerned about is that you just don't get the actual picture there. You don't get to hear the kind of stories of isolation, the stories of you feel like you're being pushed through a system of education, and that everything just matters about you performing. You must always perform. There's no care about actual intellectual curiosity, about going outside of your lessons and getting really interested in something that is not at all supported in the way that education is currently. I'm here as the Vice President of Higher Education, because I love education. I love people studying and learning and creating things, but I kind of hate universities, because my answer to is the university what's a university for? Is the university was always for the creation of the elites, and the reproduction of that knowledge. Like, sometimes I'm like pulling out my hair when I'm like, why did the university take such a weird turn during like the Thatcher era and like the start of neoliberalism, and the US and the UK really took a weird turn? And then I remind myself that places like Warwick University, set up in like the 70s, was set up with the business interests of Coventry by the local business owners. So that was pre this like kind of neoliberalism, and still in the interest of business. And then our ancient universities, what the 3 in Scotland and the 2 in England, were set up to keep education within a very certain group of people. So kind of the university has always been against us, but it's about, if the university is about the creation of an elite, I want everyone to be the elite. I want us to own every single place. So I'm still fighting for education. I still think there's like hope in the university, but it's not through a metric.
James Turner is the chief executive of the Sutton Trust, which you may be aware of. It campaigns to improve mobility through education. I'm just going to pause to tell a brief story. I did warm up thinking for this season on Tuesday night with a room full of secondary school teachers, and it was quite bracing. The conversation that we had, because I opened my opening gambit was a question to a group of people. There's like 25 of them there, and they're all relatively newly qualified secondary school teachers, all teaching in schools in London, but a mixture of state and independent schools. And I asked them whether they believed that their the role of their jobs as teachers was principally about social mobility, to aid social mobility, and they reacted very strongly against that question. And it took me most of the thinking to figure out why it was. But James, you might talk a little bit to that point, as it's the fundamental thing of what the Sutton Trust exists to do.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I guess social mobility has had a bit of a rough ride over the last year or so in the run-up to the election, and I think it depends how you frame it, because if you just think of it as being about allowing a handful of people to escape their roots and to be catapulted to success, then it is very narrow and it doesn't address all of the problems we have in society. We think of social mobility as about making sure that every young person has, from a poor background, has the same chances and choices in life as those from better off backgrounds. And so that is a much wider definition, which I think, many people would embrace. And university and going to university is part of that. I mean, we've helped over the years 35,000 or so young people from poorer homes to get into higher education. Right. So we clearly think it has a benefit. Yeah. And those benefits are much wider than simply wage returns and labour market outcomes. There's good reasons an individual and society should want more people to go to university. However, for a lot of the people we're helping and dealing with, they do want to know their chances in the labour market once they've invested their money in a university degree. Yeah. They want to know what their chances are of getting a certain job or whatever. And I think that is fine. It shouldn't be the whole debate that goes through someone's head when they're thinking about whether they should go to university. But I think particularly for sort of poor, debt-averse young people, first in their family to go to university, some sort of sense of where the university course might lead them is something that we find is very important to them.
Let's talk about value for money, because if you were to unpick the things that have happened in relation to higher education policy-wise over the last sort of 10 or 15 years, that's the big change, isn't it? The tuition fees and what have you. And then when Sir Paul and I had our conversation yesterday, you talked about this politicisation. Will you talk a little bit to that point, what you meant by that in 2017?
Oh, okay. Again, making the point that this is just about undergraduate students. Yes. Because for postgraduate students, of course, the level of fee, I mean, my university, it's an order of magnitude for a master's degree, so that puts it in perspective. Yeah. For the undergraduate fee, there was it was obviously introduced first in 2012, and then it was held at more or less the same rate. But I think there was sort of almost an acceptance of it until, as I said, 2017, and the election at that time. And if you recall what was happening, there was a declining trust in institutions that had been happening for a while in the Western world. Universities weren't exempt from that. There were lots of questions about, as you say, value for money and so on. And then you had one party who was saying, well, we should end undergraduate fees. We had another party saying, are there too many people going to university? So many of the arguments that have been swirling around about universities all of a sudden found a political place. And so the arguments became polarised. And the sort of onslaught started then. So certainly for the past 3 years, I mean, there's really been a day go by where there hasn't been some organisation or some group who've taken a poke at universities. So you know, it's been relentless. And that's different to the 3 years before. I mean, I should say, I've been a head of institution for 15 years now. When I first started, I used to get an update on news related to the higher education sector every Friday afternoon, right? And it would come in, and there'd be. By the time you got to sort of 15, 16, I was starting to get it every day. I now get it 2 or 3 times a day. There's a huge amount of media coverage, majority of it negative.
I'm going to address to the room. Would anybody like to comment on the value for money they feel they are getting or have got from their degree or otherwise? Hello.
Since I'm in like 5 days a week, I do find a strong sense of value for money, just because you do have a lot of contact hours and everything. Yeah. But I know for a fact that that's not the same across this university or like any university. I think there's like 11-hour weeks or like 5-hour weeks where people just don't feel like they're getting the proper kind of like attention, and it's a lot of just isolation in your room, just reading. And so yeah, for me it's okay, but I don't think there's a problem with.
And that's a measure of the feeling of value for money is through contact hours, how much are they getting out versus what they're putting in.
Yeah, and just kind of like that.
What would you disagree or disagree? Are you studying company?
No. I was just saying that, like, for me,
What's your name? Sorry.
Marie. Sorry. So I graduated in 2017, and I was just saying that, like, I never really used to go to my lectures or anything like that. I just used to study, and I kind of
what an admission!
Paper at the end of it. So
what did you take? What did you study?
I studied physics.
Physics. Wow. So how many hours in a week should you have been going to your lectures?
A lot.
Okay.
So I'd go to like labs and stuff, and I would just do the rest of it alone.
And physics is a cool degree to do.
Yeah.
And are you pleased that you did it?
Yeah.
Do you use it in your job?
No.
Interesting.
Yeah, but I don't think I could have got my job without it.
Without it.
So
okay.
I'm happy to have done it.
Interesting. Steph, hello.
Hi. I did politics and social policy, and I think I had 6 contact hours a week.
Right.
But for that subject, or those subjects, that's fair, because a big part of it is you have to read. They're really big ideas, and you actually just have to take time to get through everything that you need to read. So I don't think contact hours always does reflect value, because I don't know how I would have done it any other way.
Yeah, interesting. Hello, what's your name?
Harriet.
Hi, Harriet.
I think I graduated back in 2017 as well, and there was a big split between the science and arts in terms of feeling value for money. Like, there was quite a feeling that the art students, paying the same as science students, were subsidising the science students, like many contact hours and the resources they got.
Yeah.
For the art students, it was seen as a bit of a glorified library ticket that you were paying for in some senses, because again, you maybe have like 4 contact hours a week, and obviously a lot of that time was spent reading and access to the libraries, but you were still paying the same as the science students who had access to much more sophisticated resources and contact.
Yeah. What did you say you did again?
History.
History. Okay, interesting. Do you feel for yourself that you got value for money for your degree? Are you happy with the investment that you made in yourself?
I am, because we've got a lot of one-on-one time, but I think sometimes we don't get that, and then you've got minimal contact, it could feel like that.
Okay, interesting. Hello, what's your name?
Alex.
Hi, Alex.
So I'm currently studying A-levels at 6th form.
Okay.
And I'm actually part of the Social Mobility Foundation.
Oh, cool.
So I'm in a low-income area, but our school's quite high achieving.
Right.
And I've noticed that a lot of my peers, they mainly study their subjects because of their parents.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of family pressure, and especially with the maths focus, like 80% of our school studies maths. And yeah, I definitely do think that some of my peers are trying to escape their roots. even in just the way they act, like pretending with their like AirPods, pretending to be trying to reach almost a higher class, and but I don't think that they're necessarily embarrassed because of their backgrounds, but I just think that there's a lot of paternalism going around, and my school's partnered with Eton, which is a private boarding school, and I mean some of their ideas are just ludicrous, and I think that the different way of thinking, I mean they think that some of them have told me that they deserve it, and it's just ridiculous.
So if your school is partnered with Eton, what does that mean? Like, what does it mean? Do you meet up and go for tea?
So we went to visit their school, and then we had a body to tour us around, and then we just kind of discuss mainly online and just talk, trying to, I guess, get rid of that barrier.
Okay, interesting. Is that something that's set up through the Mobility Foundation, the Eton thing, or is that a separate thing?
That's different, yeah.
Okay, interesting. Where do you want to go to university?
So probably Cambridge. I'd like to study HSPS or education.
Good luck. Cool.
I wonder if I could chip in about expectation.
Yes, of course.
Because one thing that has certainly been the case since the higher fees came in, just talking about undergraduates again, is student expectations, of course, have gone up. I mean, hugely. Universities aren't getting more money, they're getting less money than they were before the fees went up, of course, but the expectations are up. And the other two things that have happened, which are quite interesting, and it's something that people didn't expect in terms of the magnitude. One of them is that students want an experience that's a lot more personal than it was historically. Institutions struggle to provide that in the way that students want it, and also want an experience that's more transactional. Part of it is the consumer notion, but part of it is the generational change. If you're a student who buys something on Amazon one night and who buys the next morning, you hope your institution will provide the sort of slick services that you're used to when you're dealing with the outside world. So there are those two things, the personal and the transactional. And I think it's fair to say that's something that most institutions are struggling with, because they're both facets of this increased expectation.
Claire?
Seems a funny old generalisation there of students wanting a degree like as if they getting a degree through Amazon Prime. Because I think we can misunderstand that student dissent as being a kind of consumer complaint. And it's no, we're rightly criticising the institutions that we're in, because say I did an art subject, and I really don't mind subsidising, the labs for the science students, or if you're all Goldsmiths design students, then I'm really impressed you guys came here, because you guys are in so much to your classrooms. It's a really intense degree. Because I think I really believe in education, so it's I would like to subsidise more education through public funds, through if I do well out of uni and I end up in a high paying job, I would want a higher tax to pay, both pay back for my education that benefited me, and then also to pay it forward for other people.
Yeah,
big old public funding.
I guess there's a sort of the feeling of value in the moment, to Harriet's point about 4 taught hours a week, and then there's a sort of feeling of value over the course of your life and everything else. There's different horizons of value assessment, isn't there? Hello. What's your name?
I'm Grace. So I studied
Hi, Grace.
geography at university, and then I ended up being a maths teacher, so I don't think I used it. But I think there's an important third factor in terms of value for money for a degree that I think universities miss out on sharing with students. That you talk about contact hours, and I definitely remember when I was studying, you divide almost your £9,000 a year by how many hours of lectures you go to, and then you go out into the real world and nothing is free, and you can't use kind of public spaces. And I think there's a big disjoint in students' understanding of when you get the access to the library and to study spaces and to a student union space and subsidised gym memberships. And I think certainly for me, access to healthcare has never been better than when I was at university, and that is done through university funding. And I think there's kind of a missing narrative that actually the fees students are paying are much bigger than just the content that you're being delivered in the lecture, but the much wider service that university provide.
Yeah, interesting. There was another hand, was that? Yes, hello, what's your name?
Nina.
Hi, Nina.
to say now, actually. So I did my undergrad many years ago. I can't remember when did you graduate? 20 sometime.
20-something.
At University of Kent, so a campus uni, and currently a part-time postgrad. And I think the idea of value for money has changed massively around doing my undergrad at campus uni and doing a postgrad, working full-time and doing that part-time. And I think, probably touching your point, I think value for money is much wider than contact hours, and it certainly was for me. I think my university experience was based around becoming the chairwoman of the rugby team, running in student politics, getting an understanding of what your wider engagement in the world was, and actually the degree was the minor part of that. I think everything I've gone into after that has been slightly relevant to my undergrad, but it's been much more about the opportunities I did outside of my formal education. And I think that often when you talk about value for money, you miss out on that kind of the wider student experience and what kind of the alternative stuff at university offers you. But definitely in my postgrad, I've gone back to thinking, actually, I'm paying 15 grand for this and I'm in 2 hours a week. And there my value for money has changed because I'm having to do almost a vocational postgrad, so it's in law, and actually that's a means to an end, whereas my undergrad was more about the experience and moving away from home and being transformative in that sense.
Interesting. There was a hand over here.
Yeah, no,
Hiya, what's your name?
Hi, I'm Johnny.
Hi, Johnny.
Yeah, I was just interested here so much about the value of money being very input-based. It seems to be all about how much contact time and things you can cram in. Whereas it feels to me, I'm just interested, how do people measure the value that they get out of it? You know, what outcomes did they get? Certainly from my, what I miss now from being in a working environment is actually time. So, having time to study, having time to explore ideas, having time to get to really understand things I think it's really, really valuable. And if you're just cramming in with like a sausage machine of, I want more stuff, that doesn't seem to me necessary to equate to value.
I'd be well up to pay £9 to have a bit of time. It's like a bargain to me.
The sad reflection.
Wenya.
Hi. So having been to university some time ago, maybe not a while ago, but not too recently, a lot of the value that I've had, definitely personally and professionally, has been network driven. So it's not so much the university sort of providing an infrastructure for me, which they definitely did. They had, pastoral care, all the rest of that stuff. But really, I think no matter whether you're in technology or something more sort of tactile or more human potentially, and I've been in both those industries, at some point sort of, no matter what job you're doing, like how you're interacting with people and getting the best out of lots of different people is fundamentally what you all end up doing. And I think no matter how intelligent or technically brilliant you are, like typically those are the people that will be driving a lot of those decisions, whether they're sincere about those decisions or whether they're not sincere about those decisions. It's your ability to influence. So I think a lot of this sort of soft skills that you get at university, a lot of the network and just that ability to converse with lots and lots of different people and have a group of people that you've bonded with in some way that they'll always support you was one of the critical things. And I do think that I think obviously we're focusing very specifically on UK education. I suppose the one thing I would say is I think it's very, very rare in the world to sort of come from any kind of background, work really hard and get into a school and pay a fee and be able to get a loan. Like that just is not happening for most of the 9 billion people in the world at all. So even if there are sort of social mobility constraints and discussions, I think in the broader context, most people do have an opportunity.
Yeah, for sure.
Whether it's easy for them or whether it's hard for them, they have some opportunity.
Excellent. That is a good point. If Chris was here, he would be whooping and clapping at that point that you just made. Hello, what's your name?
Hi, I'm Tim.
Hi, Tim.
I've just finished 5 years as a special advisor in government, so I've seen the very best and the worst.
You okay?
Humanities graduates.
Feeling all right?
And actually, I've just joined a startup that works on apprenticeships. And I suppose the thing that struck me is that we're currently talking about a very individual basis of what represents value for money. And I think we need to be looking at what represents value for money
in a macro sense
for society.
Yes.
And I suppose my ultimate conclusion is that the university is not providing that value for money, in part because more and more employers are saying that graduates are not job ready. And it's also failing the kind of big societal challenges that we face. Most graduate schemes are disproportionately taken up by people who went to private schools, regardless of what degree they got. And likewise, there's still a BME attainment gap after you graduate, no matter what degree you did. So you're still more likely to earn less regardless of how you did at university. And I think we need to look at other ways to overcome that. And naturally, I have a vested interest, but also a very passionate interest in saying that apprenticeships can be part of that solution. And actually, going back on your point, which I thought was a really important one about networks, one of the things that universities traditionally had a monopoly on is this idea that you can live outside the home, you can make friends, you can join societies, which is actually, I wish to give a plug to my business. What we try and do is for our apprentices.
He says plugging his business. I like what you've done there, Tim. Very neat.
I haven't named it, so you'll have to ask.
You can name it. It's fine.
But it's called White Hat, and we go out of our way to try and provide a community for apprentices. So if you're a 16 or an 18-year-old going into a business where you're the only person under the age of 30, you can, instead of just hanging out with people, your colleagues, you also go and hang out with our apprentice community.
Yes.
And you have sports teams, you have social clubs. You actually do a lot of training in kind of those soft skills like presentation, communication, in order to fill that gap.
Agreed. Jack, if you could put up the slide, I think it's number 3 on employers' attitudes. Well, I just come back to James. We talked yesterday about this idea that the sort of default delivery model of an undergraduate degree, remembering Paul reminds us that we're talking about undergraduates is only a fifth or thereabouts of everything that universities worry about. But you think that will change, that the default kind of, you move away from home and it takes 3 years, and that thing that I imagine as what a university is, you think that will change in relatively soon?
Yeah, and I think actually to the point on apprenticeships as well, actually we're already seeing some change there in that, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, the Sutton Trust would solely be focused on getting students into traditional undergraduate degrees as a route to social mobility. I don't see it in quite as black and white terms as degrees bad, apprenticeships good or whatever, but I think degree level apprenticeship school leaver schemes are so much better than they were 5 or 10 years ago as an alternative route to social mobility. That has to be in the mix, and that has to be in the sort of value for money mix. But equally, we're seeing more, I guess for all sorts of reasons, but not least financial reasons, we are seeing more students living locally and going to their local university. And that may or may not be a good thing. It may be good if that's an informed choice. If they're staying at their local university because they can't afford to move anywhere else and go to a university better suited to them, that is a concern from our sort of social equity point of view. But yeah, I mean, we've heard some conversation already this evening on contact hours. Already you have some providers who are condensing BAs down to 2 years, which for some young people may be the right decision. You're getting providers who are doing more online. And I'd be interested obviously in especially from running a university, but I can only see that trend accelerating. And if the default in 15 years is everyone goes away from home for a 3-year or 4-year bachelor's, I suspect that won't necessarily be the default in a few years' time.
What do you think, Sir Paul?
Well, the problem is everyone's experimenting with going online. It's the thing you would do. And it works really well with lots of master's programs. I mean, we've got lots of master's programs that we offer in Dubai. And so it reduces the number of times people have to fly into Dubai to do the program if you've got half the modules online. So it makes sense. In the problem in the UK is, and it's alluded to in one of these things, is around student mental health, and it's also around student progression. And one of the things the Office for Students records is student progression. And one of the things we know is the more students do in terms of online programs, the less likely that they are to attend, the more likely they are not to progress in first and second year and second to third year, and the more likely they are to suffer from mental health problems. So it's difficult for an institution to get those things in balance. But the other thing, sorry to mention the money, but no one's made any money out of online yet. In the UK, I mean, King's were almost doing it, but they've not managed that yet. So the only online programs that are running around are making quite a big loss. So the more you do, the more money you lose. There isn't a big incentive, where money's time.
Is there a challenge also in this country in particular compared to others around the reputation of online degrees? and how established they are in the eyes of employers.
Yeah.
It is. It's a problem. If you blend them,
yeah, we're not as advanced in terms of what employers think of those.
What's your name, sir? Sorry.
Dan.
Yeah.
Hi, Dan. And do you work in the field in
I work for a consultancy that work with universities.
Right, interesting. And do you think that is the case, that if you've done an online degree, you might not mention it?
Anecdotally, but I would say that's the case. I am also this discussion around choices between different types of provision is the wrong one in my view, because in 5 years' time, maybe 7, we're going to have 150,000 more 18-year-olds than we have now.
Right.
So we don't need to choose between online provision, traditional provision, apprenticeships. We need to do more of all of these things.
Yes, really.
And the dangerous thing about that is it requires funding. I was interested in Sir Paul's point around the funding because I think tuition fees protected universities from the worst excesses of austerity.
They did,
in a big way.
Austerity.
Because the Treasury didn't really care about universities because it was the loan book over there. So we're in a dangerous place now because the universities need to be funded appropriately, as do, technical qualifications, apprenticeships, all of that, because we're going to have too many people who need something to do and something valuable to learn to offer UK PLC, that horrible term, what they need, in the future.
It's a really good point. As to this, we could go a couple of ways. It reminds me of what we were talking about earlier, Sir Paul, about the politicisation, and you sort of have to. It seems you have to pick a team whether we switch the fees off or everybody goes to university now and it's not worth anything. Those are the two viable political arguments on the one hand, and then there's this other thing to your point about if the political sort of value equation relates to value to UK PLC, then is the higher education that's available, or indeed the apprentices, or all of the other things that you were saying, the whole gamut of people learning what they're going to need to know to generate that economic value, and that's something I really don't know. Hello, sir.
I'm Rory. I was an undergrad 5 years ago, part-time master's student. I think it's really interesting that we're having a conversation that university is there to set people up to be an employee. Like, is that how we view learning, view education? That you'll do a 3-year undergrad and then you'll become an employee somewhere? Is that how we want to create our higher education system? That might be one outcome that happens for some people, but is that how we build our entire higher education system? I don't think that should be how we build our system. We build it to create well-rounded individuals that have got really intellectually stimulating debates, enjoy reading, enjoy arts, whatever that might be for them. We live within a system where you probably have to get a job at the end and go into that world. But is that what we want fundamentally from higher education?
I think that's a really beautiful point, because it starts to hit on the structures that exist. That it's when we're thinking about 18-year-olds suddenly coming of age, and coming of age meaning coming of university going age. It's what about all the people that we want to be returning to education? Whether that is an education, higher education, or some format of further education. That I think I'm really, really interested in the idea of the structural thing, that kind of wanting education to be so much more open than it currently is. And so that's why the kind of transactional approach, I think, closes down those avenues often. But we really do want to be rethinking, because it's Open University has existed for a really long time, doing what is now, thought of as quite a new innovation of online or kind of distance learning. So it's there's been quite a few options out there, and I really would like to be expanding this in the sense of we can't just talk about university and higher education in isolation, that we also need to be talking about further education alongside that, because it only hurts all of us when we're pitting FE against HE. I'm going to go to Alfie at the back and then we'll come back to you when you're...
I work at Tortoise. So I actually went to university. One of the main reasons my parents went on about the broadening minds.
Alfie, what did you do at university? Sorry.
Politics, philosophy, and economics.
Okay.
So they said, you should go. It will just expose your mind, you'll think differently about everything. You'll learn so much. And then I went, and that's what all their friends said as well. There's this generational difference And then I went and it was like careers, 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 and everyone talks about careers. You need to do this to get this grade. Like, let's not discuss this for too long because this is the functionality of it. Like, you need to get this mark to get into here, to get into Deloitte, or so on. But then the problem is, it's not doing that either. I mean, that's the big complaint about it now. It's like all about the graduate employment rate. Someone's like, oh, what am I paying for this degree? And then it's not doing the broadening mind aspect for everyone either. I think for me it comes to mind, it's like, what is it for? This like identity crisis of like, those two things are quite different objectives. And I kind of fear it's becoming just in this middle point where it doesn't
that satisfies neither objective. When you
So on this point, so one thing we seem pretty agreed on is that for the most part that there are quite low contact hours at university. So I suppose implicitly then I would assume that a lot of students do have time. So let's say, you know, I'm really passionate about climbing or poetry or playing the saxophone. I suppose what is there that's stopping a student from pursuing the passions that are making them a well-rounded person? Because most universities, they wouldn't sort of look at somebody with a passion or a talent and actively stop them from pursuing that. So I think there are some sort of social trends and social pressures that we have on particularly young people, definitely in terms of maybe less economic security, sort of broader concerns about sort of, you know, political situation, the climate situation, sort of what kind of world are we going to inherit? And I think that can sort of leak into where are my institutions providing me with support. And I think there are times when it makes sense that an institution is providing you with structure, but I think those institutions sort of leave you a lot of scope to then decide what kind of person do I want to be, what values do I want to pursue, and I don't really see institutions stopping people becoming well-rounded people because they've got all the time and resources
to do that for themselves.
to do that for themselves.
Interesting. Hello, what's your name?
Hi, Susanna.
Hi, Susanna.
Just kind of minor counterpoints. I think you're definitely right that a lot of institutions and for a lot of people, they have a lot of time and space to do that at universities. But we have to remember that for some people going to university, they also have to work alongside of it.
Yes.
So whether that's because they're doing part-time or they just genuinely need to pay rent. And I think there's obviously been changes to maintenance, loans now, well, grants now becoming loans. And I think that problem is only becoming worse. So we're seeing, back to the kind of value for money point, the idea of like networking and building yourself as a well-rounded person, then by kind of making those systematic changes to university and the funding that's available to students themselves, we're closing those avenues off for a lot of people.
Because you have to work too to get yourself through. Hello, we'll go to, this gentleman hasn't said anything yet, I'll come back to you.
Yes, I did my...
What's your name, sorry?
My name is James.
Hi, James.
I did my business masters 25 years ago at City University.
Oh, good.
And
That's an excellent choice.
Well, I shouldn't say that in case I didn't make it the same name.
As part of that, I'm allowed to go back and do a course every year.
Cool.
I'm the only person in probably the decade that I did my degree that actually does that. And I think most people...
What kinds of things? What kinds of courses? That's
I'm sure I was supposed to be there this evening, actually. I came to this instead. But I'm doing a course on innovation. So there's lots of different ones. They're all business related. So there's an innovation course that I'm doing this year. I've done previous ones on marketing and so on. So I actually think that people, you know, that if there are more degrees that are actually seen as part of an ongoing thing, because I find it very useful to dip back into formal education in an evening once a week for a couple of months a year. I think that should be considered as part of the value that people get from perhaps a 2 or 3 year degree course that then becomes an ongoing thing, because I do that. I don't think most people do. It's quite strange to go back to a classroom. But it's a really useful way of keeping up to speed with things.
Yeah. Interesting. Where was there another hand? Oh yes, hello.
Just to go back to the point of the value for money idea and the idea of whether a degree should be about then getting employment in the future. Personally, as a student at the moment, I'm in my second year, and I think that is a huge focus for a lot of us, simply because, well, we haven't had a job necessarily yet, and we are all quite worried about the future and whether we will find the employment that we are interested in and whether we'll be able to obviously earn a decent living. And I think perhaps once you finish university and you are employed, you don't think about that as much. You think, oh, if I could go back to university, I'd focus more on, you know, getting to know people and broadening my view. But now as students, we kind of think about that future. We stress about that future because we're not there yet, and it's quite important for us. I don't know if I'm only speaking for myself, but
yeah, I don't. We mentioned this sort of like snobbery thing, and whilst I have an enormous amount of sympathy, my heart is drawn to the expand your mind, knowledge for knowledge's sake. I'm all down with that, but you do also kind of need a job. So there's a I don't know how you square that circle. I feel like people shouldn't have to apologise for feeling like they want to end up, you know, being able to land a gig. Hello, what's your name?
Tom.
Hi, Tom.
How's it going? Good?
Really good. How do you think it's going?
I went to university in California and studied in the United States and did an undergraduate degree there, and it cost close to $40,000 a year.
Whoa.
And I was lucky. I was on a scholarship. I didn't have to pay, but almost everyone else was paying that tuition. And I really struggled to find a job after because.
What did you study?
Business management.
Oh wow.
Yeah. Because there are tens of thousands of kind of like universities and colleges in the US, and the thing I think which is so important there is the value to the name of your university, and the school that I went to just had no brand name, and for a long time I was very bitter at where I went to school because it didn't really help me get into the job market, and I don't know if that's the same in the UK. I'm not from here, but that was like certainly a big part of like what I would have done differently maybe.
Yeah, interesting. Hello again.
Hiya. I know it said at the start no questions, but I think there's something quite interesting that you just picked on there as well about if we're trying to widen access to universities and we're trying to encourage social mobility through universities, what can we do to support students from disadvantaged backgrounds where universities aren't the expected option or the thing you're told to do, by giving more reassurances that they are going to result in jobs. So I used to work at a school in Bournemouth, for example, and we've got Bournemouth University on the doorstep, so maintenance loans aren't necessarily an issue, but even just the tuition fees alone, students wouldn't dream thinking of spending £9,000 a year, like my GCSE students, so I taught geography and maths. And they wouldn't dream of going to do geography at university because what job was it going to get them? But maybe they would go and do engineering, or they'd go and do nursing or midwifery. So how do we encourage students from a whole range of backgrounds to participate in the full spectrum of degrees? Because otherwise it's going to continue to be an unfair system. James, I wonder whether there's something that, how do we hold universities accountable for that aspect of widening participation?
Yeah, I mean, I think universities are under more pressure than ever before to widen access. You know, the Office for Students has set these 5-year targets, which is going to halve, apparently, the access gap of the most selective universities in 5 years. So if we get anywhere near that, that will be more progress that have been made over the last 20 years.
And what sorts of things do you do to halve the access gap?
The key things that universities and we focus on are trying to get young people from underrepresented backgrounds to apply in the first place and make good choices about the sort of places they're going to apply to and the courses that are going to suit them, and breaking down some of those misconceptions around cost and outcomes and all of those things. But then a lot of the inequalities in access to top universities are driven by grades. So poorer students, unfortunately, for a whole range of reasons, get worse results at GCSE and A-level. So universities, and this happens a bit in the American system, need to look at reducing grades for bright kids from poorer backgrounds to get them into university. But then it's also about success. So we know that a student from a poor background, given the same degree, their labour market outcomes are not as good as their more privileged peers. So it's all about making sure those disadvantaged students, whilst they're at university, can take part in all the things, the networking, the extracurriculars, all of those things, which will build their skills so they're in the best position possible to get the jobs they want at the end. And if that is investment banking, fine. If it's teaching, then fine as well. But I don't think we should deny any of those opportunities to these young people.
Yeah, interesting. Hiya, Alex.
Hi. One of the really good things is that there have been a lot of like summer programs recently. So what it does is, especially if you're in free school meals or you're from a minority, it allows those children to kind of experience and taste what education is like, and during that again they talk about misconceptions about funding and things like that, and it's really good because, for example, for the K+ program at King's, they give you a load offer if you complete the program. So I think that's really good because it's unfair to compare someone from quite a privileged background and someone from a not so privileged background and expect them to get the same results.
Right, interesting. I would really like to. I was fascinated actually when Paul was saying about how post 2017, when the whole thing was politicised and the increase in media coverage, the vast majority of which is negative, that you feel in your inbox the whole time. I'm really interested in that because I'm finding this whole topic hard to get a handle on, because I don't know if I should feel optimistic or pessimistic about higher education in general. I can find a ton of statistics, and a lot of them are in here, that's saying it's no fairer than it ever was and access is still a massive problem. I can find equivalent data points that say students are really satisfied, graduate employment rates are through the roof. So there's lots to find on both sides of the argument. I'm finding it really tough to get a sense of whether we, you know, and you know, everybody's right, on a macro sense, the higher education has never been as good as it is now by an enormous distance. You know, it's sort of enormously successful. But I'm finding it really tough to get a sense of it. Hello, what's your name?
It's Nick.
Hi, Nick.
It's a question on your question. So we're talking about higher education, but I think it'd be valuable to separate the concept, the two halves of it, which is higher education. You're saying two things. What's the value of getting a degree?
Yeah.
And what's the right way to get that degree?
Okay.
And higher education is the combination of both those things.
Yeah.
And I think to truly answer the question, we have to examine those two things separately, if that's possible for you to do within this group, if that's okay.
So, which one do you want to start us off with?
Would you like me to start?
Yeah.
Okay.
We've only got about a minute left, so we're going to have to be really, really quick.
Shall I come down there?
Yeah.
No, so look, I'll start on the value of a degree, regardless of who provides it.
Yeah.
We have 150 million more people entering potential higher education by 2030. If you look at post-secondary, there's 470 million people globally who would need post-secondary education for a very uncertain future of work.
Yeah.
And there are a vast number of people getting into the provision of a degree, in inverted commas.
Yeah.
Anybody from a university to online, offline, even to companies who are saying, join us and we will give you a degree. So is the value of a degree therefore reducing, particularly when you consider that some companies are removing the degree even from the CV, for example. So I would argue that where we're heading, separate to how you get your degree, the badge of honour, the brand, whatever, okay, the actual value of a degree is decreasing in the future world.
So there are some significant amount of nodding heads. Let's have that as a question. Do you think that the value of a degree, to the way that Nick has defined it just there, is decreasing or set to decrease over the next, let's say, 5 years? Put your hand up. People who think, that's about half the room, I would say. She's put her flag in the air, but I'm going to go to Claire on that point.
I could probably put my hand up there, but I only mind the degree value decreasing in society, because I really want a change that, like, we can't talk about higher education in isolation from what's happening to the economic systems around us, that the NHS is failing right now. We don't have enough public funds for that, and we also, like, we're talking so much about access actually and, like, widening participation without querying why is it that, like, we don't have enough funding for all of our schools, and why is it that there are some schools that are Eton and that are definitely not Eton, you know, that, like, kind of, I sit on a lot of boards and panels for access in my role, and it's just people are saying, like, oh no, once you get to sixth form, once you get to university, it's too late to talk about accessibility, you know, widening participation, it's got to happen at birth, all of this, and it's like, so why isn't it? You know, why aren't we having kids learning and growing up in worlds where they can access healthcare and they can access education, and it's not split between what you're making? And then also thinking about, like, we want jobs, you know, but we also want to be happy as well. That, like, so often the job market we're going into, isn't great either. It's like similarly competitive and like makes like the overwork we all have also then burdens the NHS. So it's like higher education is only part of this conversation, and we must widen it out for us to like have any real change. I think that's really like what I'm really invested in for like the rest of my life, is to really be questioning that. So.
Well, you're in luck, because after this conversation, the future of learning adventure rumbles on, and we'll have conversations about what types of skills all types of different educational institutions should be focusing on, and how we rewire the whole system for a 60-year career where we're all going to be having to retrain and relearn, and all the whole thing, the whole picture going to change. So we've sort of cracked open the beginnings of this conversation this evening. Thank you very much, everybody, for being here. Thank you in particular to Goldsmiths for coming all the way up from New Cross. I am currently also a Goldsmith student, would you believe? I don't go very often. I want to try and pick up some of the points. There have been a lot that have been really salient, and what normally happens is I go on the tube and that things sort of percolate in my mind. Dan's point about 150,000 more 18-year-olds in, I forget how far away, about 7 years, did you say? And how unhelpful, and a couple of people have mentioned this, it's unhelpful to decide whether one or the other is better. The point is we're going to need more of all of it, which raises a really, really big funding question. Now that the sort of horrible first lot of Brexit lorry has departed, we will discover, won't we, what Boris Johnson and his government find priorities in relation to education systems. So we will watch that very closely, and arguably anxious-making thought. So Paul mentioned a few things that I think are really important, and that thing about how complex a university is as an organisation. And even though a lot of our conversation this evening is necessarily focused on sort of UK undergraduates, that's only 22% of what a university sort of turnover is. And the sort of that complexity, I think, is reflected in what we've been grappling with in the conversation, which is a university can't be a factory for making employees, to Rory's point, but the reality of the world in which we live means it can neither be a sort of highfalutin seat of grand ephemeral thought, much as that might be a nice idea. The reality is we just don't live in that kind of world. I loved Johnny's point about to assess value in a macro and a micro sense in terms of outcomes, and how you describe time as a thing, notwithstanding what Susanna pointed out, that's not everybody's experience of when they study, sort of acres of time and days and what have you in between your contact hours. I thought that was a really nice picture. And then we kept coming back to, didn't we, this idea of the market and the competition, and Claire's point, which is that student dissent can't be interpreted as a customer complaint in the same way. We sort of need to think about it something different, because after all, this is your whole life for 3 years or 4 or whatever. I was fascinated by the idea that online models, fancy online models, have a higher dropout rate and disproportionately overrepresent on mental health problems. I think that's interesting and something to bear in mind as we sort of hasten towards technology as the magic solution for everything. White Hat are a brilliant organisation, by the way, and partner with us at Tortoise, repping for apprenticeships, which, to your point, James, as well, variety of options. I really liked, finally, Alfie's summary of his experience of doing PPE, with his mum and dad going, go on, Alfie, do PPE and broaden your mind and absorb the world and come back enriched. And then he gets there and it's, okay, we're going to go and meet the people from Deloitte because you're going to go and be a management consultant. And the sort of identity crisis is the way that he characterised that. I thought was actually a sort of interesting summary of perhaps some of these tensions. So like I say, as often the case, early in a season, we've opened more cans of worms than we've closed. But it's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you very much for being here, and do have a safe journey home. Thank you.